Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the smoke-filled nights of Prohibition-era Chicago, where neon buzzed above crowded streets and loyalty shifted as fast as the money changed hands. This is the world of Jack McGurn, a man of style and calculation, where charm hid sharp instincts and survival depended on knowing when to smile and when to disappear. Most people couldn't last in a life like this, not because of constant violence, but because it demanded flawless timing, quiet discipline, and the ability to move unseen in a city that never truly slept. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the smooth, dangerous world of Jack McGurn. The first thing people noticed about Jack McGurn wasn't fear. It was charm, the kind that slipped into a room ahead of him, settled into the corners, and made people feel at ease before they ever realized they'd been paying attention. On quiet Chicago nights, when the streetlights hummed and the city breathed in low, steady rhythms, Jack learned early that influence didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walked in smiling, impeccably dressed, and ordered coffee like it belonged there. Jack wasn't born into legend. He was born Vincenzo Gibaldi, the son of Italian immigrants who came to America carrying hope, worry, and a belief that hard work would carve out a future. The neighborhood taught him lessons faster than school ever could. Streets were classrooms, people were textbooks, and survival, Jack learned, depended on understanding human nature more than rules. As a boy, he watched men gather on corners, talk quietly, exchange looks that said more than words. He noticed who listened and who spoke, who lingered and who disappeared. The city was alive with invisible currents, and Jack paid attention. While others chased noise, he studied silence. He learned that timing mattered, that confidence could be worn like a tailored suit, and that respect was earned not by shouting, but by knowing when not to. His childhood was shaped by loss early on. His father's passing left a gap that never fully closed, but it also sharpened Jack's sense of responsibility. He understood quickly that protection didn't come automatically. It was something you built piece by piece, through loyalty, awareness, and the ability to read a room before the room read you. He grew up fast, not in years, but in instincts. Chicago in those days was a city of motion and momentum. Opportunity brushed shoulders with danger, and ambition moved just as quickly as the elevated trains overhead. Jack absorbed it all. He saw how power gathered quietly around certain people. Not always the loudest, not always the strongest, but the ones others deferred to without being asked. By his late teens, Jack had reinvented himself. The name Vincenzo felt tied to a life of limitation, so he became Jack. American-sounding, smooth, adaptable. He dressed sharply, spoke carefully, and listened more than he talked. People underestimated him, and Jack learned to let them. Underestimation was a gift if you knew how to use it. He found work where he could, sometimes legitimate, sometimes less so, but always close to people who understood how the city really worked. He ran errands, passed messages, made himself useful without being intrusive. Reliability became his currency. When Jack said he'd do something, it got done. That reputation followed him, opening doors that never announced themselves. It wasn't long before Jack crossed paths with men whose names carried weight. They moved with purpose, spoke with authority, and expected competence. Jack delivered. He never rushed, never boasted. He observed how these men handled pressure, how they maintained composure when situations tightened. Power, Jack realized, wasn't just about control, it was about restraint. His rise wasn't dramatic. There were no grand entrances, no sudden transformations. It was gradual, almost invisible. One conversation led to another. One favor led to trust. Jack became someone people relied on, not because he demanded loyalty, but because he understood it. He valued discretion. He knew that secrets were heavier than gold, and silence was often the smartest response. At night, when the city slowed, Jack would walk alone, thinking. He reflected on conversations, replayed interactions, studied expressions he might have missed. He treated life like a long chess match, where every move mattered, even the ones that seemed insignificant. Sleep came easily to him, not because life was simple, but because he accepted its complexity. Chicago rewarded those who adapted, and Jack adapted well. He learned that image mattered. He cultivated style, confidence, and an air of calm that made people trust him without quite knowing why. He didn't chase attention. Attention came to him, curious and cautious. By the time Jack McGurn was truly known by that name, he had already mastered the art of being indispensable without being obvious. He understood that power wasn't about standing in the spotlight. It was about controlling where the light fell. And as the city continued to shift and expand around him, Jack stood steady, prepared for the chapters ahead, knowing that the most important moves were still waiting to be made. By the time Jack McGurn settled fully into his new name, Chicago had begun to feel like a living organism to him, breathing, shifting, reacting. The city wasn't just streets and buildings anymore. It was moods, alliances, unspoken rules, and long memories. Jack moved through it with growing confidence, not because he believed himself invincible, but because he understood how fragile everything really was. That understanding made him careful. Careful became his advantage. He learned quickly that trust in Chicago wasn't given in speeches or handshakes. It was tested in quiet moments, in whether you showed up when expected, whether you kept your voice steady when tensions rose, whether you knew when to leave a room before saying too much. Jack passed those tests not by trying to impress, but by staying consistent. People noticed. They always did. There were nights when he sat in dimly lit cafes, listening more than speaking, letting conversations flow around him like smoke. He absorbed details, names mentioned casually, grievances hinted at, alliances forming beneath polite laughter. He rarely interrupted. When he did speak, it was measured, thoughtful, just enough to show he understood. People walked away from those conversations feeling heard, and that feeling mattered more than Jack realized at first. His reputation grew quietly. Someone would say, "Ask Jack. He'll know," or "Jack's reliable." The word spread faster than he ever could have planned. Reliability became his calling card. In a city full of risk-takers and loud personalities, Jack's calm presence felt grounding. He didn't rush decisions. He didn't escalate situations unnecessarily. He understood that longevity came from stability, not spectacle. As his circle widened, Jack became more aware of the delicate balance between visibility and anonymity. He dressed well, carried himself with confidence, but avoided drawing attention that couldn't be controlled. He chose his words carefully, understanding that language could open doors or quietly close them forever. Humor, he learned, was useful, but only when used sparingly. A well-timed smile could soften a room. A poorly timed one could harden it. Mentorship came from unexpected places. Older men, seasoned by years of navigating the city's shifting dynamics, offered advice in fragments rather than lectures. Jack listened. He learned that patience wasn't passive, it was strategic. Waiting allowed situations to reveal themselves. Acting too quickly often meant acting without understanding. He also learned that loyalty was rarely simple. People were loyal to outcomes, to security, to familiarity. Jack didn't judge this, he accounted for it. He built relationships that aligned interests rather than demanded devotion. That approach created a network that held together not because it had to, but because it worked. There were moments when the weight of responsibility pressed in. Jack wasn't naive. He understood that influence came with consequences, that every decision echoed outward in ways he couldn't always predict. On those nights, sleep came slower. He'd stare at the ceiling, replaying conversations, questioning whether he'd said too much or too little. But by morning, clarity returned. He trusted his instincts, refined through observation and experience. Chicago continued to change. Businesses rose and fell. Neighborhoods shifted. New faces appeared, eager and ambitious. Jack adapted without losing himself. He welcomed change cautiously, assessing motivations before offering trust. He learned that enthusiasm could be genuine or dangerous, depending on what fueled it. His social skills deepened. Jack understood how to make people comfortable without making promises he couldn't keep. He mastered the art of listening with intent, of making eye contact that conveyed respect without challenge. These small details shaped how others perceived him, and perception, he knew, often became reality. There were times when tension hung thick in the air, when disagreements threatened to spiral. Jack often found himself stepping into these moments, not as a forceful presence, but as a calming one. He reframed conversations, redirected focus, reminded people of shared interests. Resolution, he believed, was always preferable to escalation. It preserved relationships and conserved energy, both invaluable resources. As his influence expanded, Jack remained aware of the line between confidence and complacency. He continued to learn, to watch, to adjust. He never assumed he'd arrived. Arrival, he believed, was a dangerous illusion. The city rewarded those who stayed alert. Despite his growing prominence, Jack maintained a sense of personal discipline. He valued routine, quiet moments of reflection, and the simple act of walking the city streets alone. These walks grounded him. They reminded him of where he came from, of the boy who watched and learned, who understood early that survival depended on awareness. Relationships became layered. Some were built on trust, others on mutual benefit, a few on genuine friendship. Jack treated each with care, knowing that misunderstanding often began when people confused one for another. He was generous with advice, cautious with commitments, and firm when boundaries were crossed. Through it all, Jack McGurn remained composed. The charm that first defined him evolved into something deeper, an assurance that came from understanding both himself and the world around him. He didn't chase power. He positioned himself where power flowed naturally. That distinction mattered. By the end of this chapter of his life, Jack stood at a crossroads few could see. His name carried weight now. His presence influenced outcomes. And yet, he remained the same careful observer at heart, aware that every step forward required balance. The city watched him, even if it didn't yet realize it. And Jack, ever attentive, watched the city right back, preparing for the moments that would soon test everything he had learned. Jack McGurn reached a point where the city no longer felt like something he was learning. Felt like something he understood. Not perfectly, no one ever did, but well enough to sense when currents shifted beneath the surface. He had developed an intuition that went beyond instinct. It was pattern recognition, born from years of watching how people moved, how alliances formed and faded, how confidence could rise overnight and collapse just as quickly. He noticed how some men chased attention and burned out, while others stayed quiet and lasted. Jack chose the second path. He didn't rush rooms anymore. He let rooms come to him. When he entered a space, conversations subtly adjusted. Not because he demanded it, but because people were aware of him. Awareness was power's quiet cousin. His days became fuller, layered with responsibility. People sought his opinion more often now, sometimes openly, sometimes indirectly. A question phrased casually. A glance held a second longer than necessary. Jack answered carefully. He had learned that words, once spoken, couldn't be retrieved. He preferred suggestions over declarations, guidance over instruction. This made people feel like decisions were theirs, even when Jack had helped shape them. With influence came pressure. Expectations grew. Jack felt it in the pauses before. Conversations began, in the way people waited to see how he'd react before choosing their own response. He adapted by staying composed. Calm became his signature. Even when uncertainty crept in, he didn't let it surface. He knew that doubt, once visible, spread quickly. Chicago's nights were still his favorite. The city revealed itself differently after dark. Quieter, more honest. Jack often found himself walking alone, hands in his coat pockets, replaying the day. He thought about motives, about who benefited from what, about where trust was solid and where it was conditional. He accepted that not everyone could be trusted fully. That wasn't cynicism. It was clarity. He began to understand the importance of distance. Being too close to everything blurred judgment. Jack created space, emotional and strategic. He remained accessible but not exposed. This allowed him to see situations more clearly, to assess without being pulled into unnecessary drama. Distance gave him leverage. There were moments when old acquaintances tried to test him, to see if the charming young man they once knew was still there. Jack met those moments with quiet confidence. He hadn't changed in essence, but he had evolved. He was no longer proving himself. He was maintaining equilibrium. His relationships with influential figures deepened, but Jack never mistook proximity for security. He understood that respect had to be renewed continuously. One careless decision could undo years of careful work. That awareness kept him disciplined. He avoided excess. He chose moderation where others indulged. Self-control, he believed, was the clearest sign of strength. At the same time, Jack didn't isolate himself. He knew that influence thrived on connection. He made time for conversations that weren't transactional, for shared laughter, for moments that reminded people he was human, not just strategic. These moments built goodwill that no agreement ever could. Challenges emerged, as they always did. Misunderstandings, rival ambitions, competing interests. Jack approached each with patience. He listened first. He asked questions that revealed underlying concerns. Often, the real issue wasn't what people claimed it was. Jack had learned to hear what wasn't being said. In tense situations, his presence had a calming effect. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, reminding people of the bigger picture. He reframed problems as opportunities for cooperation rather than conflict. This approach didn't just solve immediate issues, it reinforced his role as someone who could be relied upon when things became complicated. Yet, despite his growing stature, Jack remained introspective. He questioned himself regularly. Was he moving too quickly? Too slowly? Was he trusting the right people? These internal check-ins kept him grounded. He never allowed success to dull his awareness. He thought often about identity, about the journey from Vincenzo to Jack. The transformation wasn't just in name, it was in mindset. Jack had become someone who understood that identity was fluid, shaped by choices, not origins. He honored where he came from without being confined by it. As months turned into years, Jack found himself standing at the edge of greater responsibility. Opportunities loomed that required careful consideration. He knew that the next steps would define not just his influence, but his legacy. He felt ready, but readiness didn't erase caution. The city continued to hum around him, indifferent and ever-changing. Jack accepted this. He didn't seek permanence in structures or positions. He sought it in principles, consistency, awareness, restraint. These were the things that endured. On one particularly quiet evening, as he watched the lights flicker on across the skyline, Jack felt a sense of clarity. Not certainty, clarity. He understood that the path ahead would demand even greater discipline, sharper judgment, and unwavering composure. He welcomed the challenge. Jack McGurn had become a man who knew when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when silence carried more weight. The city had shaped him, and now, in subtle ways, he was shaping the city in return. And as the next chapter approached, he stood steady, fully aware that everything he had learned so far was preparation for what lay ahead. By the time Jack McGurn reached this phase of his life, he had learned that momentum could be both a gift and a risk. Things were moving faster now. Conversations carried more weight. Decisions echoed longer. And while the city still felt familiar, it no longer felt forgiving. Chicago had a way of rewarding those who stayed sharp and correcting those who grew careless. Jack had no intention of becoming the latter. He noticed how people watched him when he entered a room. Not openly, not obviously, but enough. Pause in speech. A subtle adjustment in posture. A glance exchanged between two people who hadn't realized they were doing it. Jack didn't react to any of it. He let the moment pass naturally. Attention, he knew, was only useful if it didn't control you. What had changed most was responsibility. Jack wasn't just navigating his own path anymore. His decisions affected others. People aligned themselves with him because they believed he brought stability. That belief mattered. It meant he had to be deliberate, even when temptation suggested shortcuts. Shortcuts often looked appealing in the moment, but Jack had seen how quickly they collapsed. He spent more time listening than ever before. Listening had become an art to him. He could tell when someone wanted advice, when they wanted reassurance, and when they simply wanted to feel acknowledged. Jack gave each person what the moment required, never more, never less. Oversharing weakened position. Restraint strengthened it. There were evenings when he found himself in quiet conversations with men who had been around longer than he had. These weren't dramatic exchanges. They were slow, thoughtful, often accompanied by long silences. Jack valued those silences. They carried lessons that words sometimes couldn't. He learned that the most seasoned figures weren't the ones who talked about power, but the ones who understood its cost. Chicago's pace continued to shift. New faces appeared, eager and ambitious, hungry for recognition. Jack watched them carefully. He recognized the signs: overconfidence, impatience, the desire to be seen. He had once been close to that himself. The difference now was perspective. Jack knew that being seen too clearly made you easier to predict. His personal discipline tightened. He kept his routines simple. Early mornings, measured evenings. He avoided excess not because he lacked appetite for life, but because he understood balance. Balance kept the mind clear. Clear minds made better decisions. There were moments of tension that tested his composure. Situations where emotions ran high, where misunderstandings threatened to grow into something larger. Jack stepped into those moments with calm authority. He didn't assign blame. He redirected focus. He reminded people of shared interests and long-term goals. Often that was enough. People wanted to be reminded that chaos was optional. Jack's charm hadn't faded. It had matured. It was no longer the easy confidence of youth, but something steadier, more grounded. People trusted him because he didn't overpromise. When Jack spoke, it was because he had thought something through. That consistency built a reputation that no announcement ever could. Despite everything, Jack never forgot where he started. He remembered the boy who watched from the edges, learning before acting. That memory kept him humble. It reminded him that no position was permanent, no influence guaranteed. Everything required maintenance, relationships, reputation, self-control. He also began to understand solitude differently. Being alone wasn't isolation. It was clarity. Jack valued moments when he could think without interruption, when he could examine his own motives honestly. He asked himself difficult questions. Was he acting out of habit or intention? Was he choosing what was easy or what was right? These questions didn't always have simple answers, but asking them kept him aligned. As his role expanded, Jack became more selective. Not every opportunity deserved pursuit. Not every alliance was worth forming. He evaluated situations based on long-term impact rather than short-term gain. This approach sometimes meant saying no when others expected yes. Jack was comfortable with that. Disappointment was temporary. Consequences were not. The city tested him as it always did. Rumors surfaced. Misinterpretations spread. Jack responded not with defensiveness, but with consistency. He knew that time clarified truth better than confrontation ever could. Staying steady was often the most powerful response. One night, walking beneath the glow of street lamps, Jack reflected on how far he'd come. The city felt quieter in that moment, as if giving him space to think. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt focused. There was still much ahead, still challenges he hadn't faced yet, but he trusted his foundation. Jack McGurn had learned that influence wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about guiding them, about understanding people well enough to anticipate where things were headed and adjusting before problems became crises. That understanding gave him confidence, not arrogance. As the next chapter of his life approached, Jack remained attentive, disciplined, and calm. He knew that the path forward would demand even more from him. More patience, more restraint, more clarity. And he was ready, not because he believed himself untouchable, but because he respected how fragile success could be. The city continued to move, restless and alive. And Jack moved with it, steady and observant, prepared for whatever the streets, the people, and time itself would place in his way. Next, Jack McGurn entered the stretch of his life with a sharpened awareness that reputation, once formed, could either carry you forward or quietly weigh you down. By now, his name traveled ahead of him, not loudly, but with intention. People didn't repeat it casually. They measured when to say it and to whom. Jack understood that this kind of recognition was both an achievement and a responsibility. He became more deliberate in how he spent his time, where he went, who he was seen with, who he wasn't. The city had a long memory, and Jack had learned that associations could speak louder than explanations. He chose carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the balance he had built. Stability mattered more to him now than momentum. There were moments when opportunity arrived dressed as urgency, invitations framed as necessities, decisions pressed as time-sensitive. Jack learned to slow those moments down. He asked questions. He waited. Urgency, he believed, was often a test, one designed to see who could be rushed into mistakes. Jack refused to be hurried. His days were filled with conversations that required tact. Some people came to him seeking direction, others seeking validation, and a few seeking leverage. Jack treated each with the same calm demeanor, never revealing which he believed them to be. He understood that people often revealed their intentions on their own, given enough space. Chicago itself felt different now. Not changed exactly, but clearer. Jack could sense tension before it surfaced, opportunity before it was announced. He paid attention to patterns. Who stopped showing up, who suddenly appeared more often, who spoke more than usual. These shifts told stories if you knew how to listen. He also became more protective of his inner circle. Trust, once given freely in youth, was now granted cautiously. Jack believed in loyalty, but he believed more in consistency. Words mattered less than behavior repeated over time. He watched how people handled disappointment, how they reacted when things didn't go their way. Those moments revealed character more accurately than success ever could. There were nights when Jack felt the weight of expectation settle heavily on his shoulders. Not fear, but responsibility. He understood that people relied on his judgment, sometimes without realizing it. That reliance required care. He avoided decisions made from emotion. Emotion clouded clarity, and clarity was his greatest asset. Jack's charm, once effortless, had become intentional. He used it strategically, not habitually. A smile here, a pause there. He knew when to engage warmly and when to remain neutral. Neutrality, he had learned, was often misunderstood as weakness. In truth, it was strength, the strength to observe without reacting, to remain centered while others rushed. He reflected often on identity, on how easily a person could be reshaped by perception. Jack made sure his actions aligned with the image he projected. Not perfection, but reliability. He didn't need to be admired. He needed to be trusted. Trust endured longer than admiration ever did. As his influence expanded, so did the number of people who misunderstood him. Some thought him colder than he was. Others thought him more calculating. Jack accepted this. He understood that being fully understood by everyone was neither possible nor desirable. Mystery preserved space. Space preserved flexibility. One of his greatest strengths became restraint. When others escalated, Jack de-escalated. When others boasted, he listened. When others reacted, he waited. This restraint unsettled some people. They didn't know how to read him, and unpredictability, when paired with calm, created respect. Jack also learned to let go. Not every disagreement needed resolution. Not every misunderstanding needed correction. Some things resolve themselves when left alone. Intervention, he believed, should be purposeful, not habitual. Knowing when not to act was just as important as knowing when to step in. He found comfort in routine again. Familiar streets, familiar faces, quiet moments with coffee and thought. These routines grounded him, reminding him that beneath the layers of responsibility and perception, he was still a man navigating choices one day at a time. The city continued to test him subtly. Small challenges, quiet shifts. Jack met each with the same steady approach. He didn't celebrate victories loudly. He didn't dwell on setbacks. He viewed both as information, feedback that helped him adjust and refine his course. At times, he thought about the future more seriously than before. Not in terms of ambition, but sustainability. How long could influence last? What did it require to endure? Jack believed the answer lay in adaptability. The city would change. People would change. He would need to change too without losing his core. By the end of this chapter, Jack McGurn stood firmly rooted, not rigid, but resilient. He had learned that strength didn't come from force or visibility, but from composure, consistency, and the ability to remain thoughtful in a world that rewarded impulsiveness. As he looked ahead, Jack knew the coming chapters would demand even greater discipline. The stakes would rise. The margins for error would narrow. But he felt prepared, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned how to ask the right questions and when to wait patiently for them to reveal themselves. The city moved on as it always did, and Jack moved with it, quietly, deliberately, carrying forward the lessons that had shaped him, ready for whatever the next turn in the road would bring. Jack McGurn's life by this stage had settled into a rhythm of measured control and careful influence, yet the world around him remained unpredictable. Chicago, ever restless, pulsed with opportunity and tension alike. Every street, every conversation, every handshake could signal a subtle shift in fortune or alignment. Jack understood that his position, while strengthened over the years, required continuous attention. Complacency was a luxury he could not afford, and he had no intention of ever indulging it. He had become more deliberate than ever in choosing his associations. Friends and allies weren't just companions, they were reflections of his own judgment. Each person in his circle was there because they had proven themselves quietly, repeatedly. Jack valued consistency over enthusiasm, reliability over bravado. He observed carefully how people behaved under pressure, how they acted when rewards were plentiful and when challenges arose. Patterns, he knew, never truly lied. Jack had a way of blending charm with authority that few could resist. He didn't need to command attention. Attention followed him naturally. But he had learned the importance of restraint. To dominate too openly invited scrutiny and resentment, both dangerous and unnecessary. So he mastered the subtle arts, silence that implied observation, gestures that implied confidence, and words that carried weight far beyond their number. He spent long hours reflecting on strategy, on timing, on the sequence of events that could either consolidate influence or undermine it. Jack had developed the patience to let situations unfold to reveal their true nature. He intervened only when the outcomes aligned with his understanding of the bigger picture. This patience wasn't passive. It was a deliberate form of action, one that allowed him to conserve energy while still guiding outcomes in ways others often didn't perceive. The streets of Chicago were a classroom that never closed. Jack walked them frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by trusted associates. He listened to the ebb and flow of conversations, to the silent signals of tension and opportunity, to the ways the city itself whispered its secrets. Even as his influence expanded, he refused to be removed from the ground realities that had taught him so much. Observation, he realized, was not just a skill, it was a responsibility. Jack had learned that power often tested the moral fabric of those who held it. He had faced choices that required balancing ambition with ethics, influence with restraint, personal gain with long-term stability. Mistakes could cost more than reputations. They could alter the trajectory of relationships and even livelihoods. Jack approached each decision with deliberate care, weighing not only immediate consequences but the ripple effects that would echo over months and years. His personal discipline had evolved. Life's luxuries no longer distracted him. They were tools to be used thoughtfully. He avoided indulgences that dulled judgment. He cultivated routines that enhanced clarity. Early mornings, deliberate walks, quiet reflection. Jack had found that consistency in life mirrored consistency in strategy. Both were vital for sustained influence. Jack's reputation as a mediator and problem solver deepened. People sought him out not for spectacle, but for judgment. When disputes arose, sometimes personal, sometimes strategic. Jack's input carried authority because he had earned it through years of observation, reliability, and measured action. He could defuse tension with subtle gestures, strategic questions, and calm guidance. Influence, he understood, was less about asserting control and more about guiding others to solutions they accepted as their own. The boy who once observed from the corners of Chicago had matured into a man who shaped the city's currents without forcing them. He understood the delicate interplay between perception and reality. People responded to Jack not just because of what he did, but because of what they believed he could do. He cultivated this perception carefully, never overextending, never revealing more than necessary, always leaving room for imagination. Jack also mastered the art of selective generosity. He supported allies in ways that were meaningful but measured, providing assistance that strengthened loyalty without creating dependency. His kindness, tempered with discretion, became a silent form of power. People trusted him because they felt his support was earned, not given lightly, and his judgment was rarely questioned. Reflection remained a constant companion. Jack reviewed past interactions, anticipating outcomes and identifying subtle missteps. He assessed motives, recalibrated alliances, and prepared for future challenges. This level of introspection kept him agile. The city's pressures and unpredictabilities never caught him entirely unprepared. Chicago, with its shifting neighborhoods, evolving businesses, and constant movement of people, demanded adaptability. Jack thrived in this environment because he didn't resist change. He anticipated it, integrated it, and used it to reinforce his position. Change was neither threat nor opportunity alone. It was information. And information, when understood, became influence. By now, Jack had come to understand that influence was layered, often invisible to casual observers. He didn't need to dominate conversations or command attention in meetings. The mere knowledge that he was watching, thinking, and acting with awareness was often enough to guide decisions, alter behavior, and shape outcomes. People adjusted subconsciously, aligning with his presence even when he remained silent. Jack's patience had deepened into a form of strategy that few could replicate. While others acted impulsively, chasing immediate gains, he let events unfold, positioning himself to benefit from outcomes while mitigating risks. He knew when to speak, when to act, and when to let silence do the work of influence. Timing, he understood, was as critical as intention. Personal life and responsibilities continued to ground him. Family, friends, and close associates formed the core of his world. He treated these relationships with the same care he applied to his broader interactions, understanding that trust, once broken, was difficult to repair. He valued integrity and consistency above all else, recognizing that these qualities endured longer than any temporary advantage. As he navigated the next stage of his life, Jack remained acutely aware of legacy. Not in terms of fame or notoriety, but in terms of lasting impact. The structures he built, relationships, influence, and strategies would outlive any individual moment. Jack measured success by the endurance of the trust he cultivated and the subtle control he maintained over outcomes, not by immediate accolades. The city itself became a partner in his calculations. He observed patterns in commerce, social dynamics, and behavior. Neighborhoods shifted in rhythm, alliances formed like currents beneath the surface, and Jack adapted without visible disruption. Influence, he realized, was often about motion, not stasis, the ability to flow with change while guiding it gently toward desired outcomes. Despite the growing responsibilities and expanding influence, Jack never lost sight of humility. He recognized that luck, timing, and circumstance played roles as important as strategy and skill. Respecting these forces kept him grounded, preventing overconfidence and maintaining a careful, deliberate approach to life. By the end of this stage, Jack McGurn had matured into a figure who combined observation, patience, and strategic foresight with a quiet, commanding presence. He had learned the art of guiding outcomes without forcing them, of shaping influence without making it obvious. The city recognized him, whether consciously or not, as a steadying presence, someone who could navigate complexity with grace and intelligence. Jack understood that the most important moves were rarely dramatic. They were small, calculated, and deliberate. Influence was cumulative, built over years of careful observation, quiet decisions, and unwavering consistency. The city had become an extension of his awareness, and he had become a master at reading its currents, anticipating shifts, and guiding outcomes subtly but effectively. And so, as the streets of Chicago pulsed around him, Jack McGurn prepared for the challenges and opportunities still ahead. He had built a foundation rooted in patience, clarity, and understanding. A foundation that allowed him to move through the city with confidence, ready to shape the next chapter of his life with the same quiet determination that had brought him this far. Jack McGurn, at this stage of his life, had become an architect of subtle influence, a man whose presence alone could alter the dynamics of a room without a single overt command. Chicago, with all its energy, unpredictability, and hidden currents, was no longer just a city he inhabited. It was an extension of his awareness. Every building, every alley, every casual conversation carried meaning, and Jack had learned to read them all with precision. By now, he had internalized the understanding that true influence was often invisible. People moved in ways that seemed natural, yet they were subtly guided by his presence, his reputation, and the carefully maintained equilibrium he fostered. Jack rarely needed to speak to command attention. The mere possibility that he was observing was enough to prompt restraint, thoughtfulness, and cooperation among those around him. It was an art he honed over years of observation, trial, and reflection. Jack's patience, which had once been a strategic choice, had become instinctive. He allowed situations to unfold, trusting that time revealed the truth and that impulsive decisions often carried hidden costs. His ability to wait, to absorb information, and to act at the precise moment had become his signature strength. Others might chase immediate rewards, but Jack knew the long game was far more powerful. The city rewarded those who understood rhythm and timing, and Jack had mastered both. The network of relationships he had built was now both broad and delicate. Friends, allies, and associates relied on him not just for guidance but also for stability. Loyalty was earned, and he monitored it carefully, observing how people behaved under stress, success, and uncertainty. Consistency became the measure of character, and Jack rewarded it with measured support. He knew that trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild. It was a lesson he never forgot. Chicago itself continued to shift and change. New faces arrived, bringing ambition and uncertainty. Old players faded, their influence waning, sometimes quietly, sometimes dramatically. Jack moved through these shifts with a sense of calm assurance. He had learned that visibility could be dangerous. Being seen too clearly made one predictable. Thus, he maintained a balance, present enough to guide outcomes but subtle enough to remain flexible. He spent countless hours walking the city streets alone, observing patterns and behaviors, thinking through consequences of past actions, and planning for the future. These walks were more than routine. They were meditative, grounding him in the realities of the world he navigated daily. In the quiet, he could analyze interactions, assess motives, and refine strategies without the interference of noise or expectation. Conversations had become an intricate dance. Jack had developed the skill of listening in layers. He heard not just words but intent, emotion, hesitation, and even unspoken desire. By tuning into these subtleties, he could guide discussions toward outcomes that were mutually beneficial without ever forcing a decision. People felt empowered, respected, and understood, often unaware that their choices were influenced by Jack's careful orchestration. He had learned the strategic value of restraint and subtlety. Not every dispute needed intervention. Not every opportunity required immediate action. Knowing when to wait was as crucial as knowing when to act. By exercising discretion, Jack preserved energy, maintained influence, and avoided unnecessary conflicts. His calm demeanor became a source of reassurance, a stabilizing force amid the city's ever-present chaos. Jack also became deeply aware of the balance between personal integrity and practical necessity. He navigated complex situations with an understanding that moral compromise was sometimes unavoidable, Yet he sought to act in ways that preserved dignity, fairness, and trust wherever possible. He had seen how unchecked ambition or ethical shortcuts could unravel carefully built networks, and he remained vigilant against such risks. Family and close friends were central to his grounding. Despite his increasing influence and the complexity of his public interactions, Jack never neglected these personal connections. He understood that relationships built on genuine care and respect offered strength that strategic alliances alone could not. These relationships reminded him of the man he had been, the boy who first navigated Chicago streets, and the values he chose to maintain despite external pressures. Jack had also developed an acute understanding of human psychology. He observed how people reacted to power, attention, and perceived influence. Some were emboldened, some intimidated, some resentful. By understanding these reactions, Jack could anticipate behavior, preempt conflicts, and reinforce loyalty. His decisions were rarely impulsive. They were calculated based on observation, experience, and intuition honed over years. Through all of this, Jack remained vigilant. Influence was not static. It required maintenance and awareness. Alliances needed nurturing, trust required reinforcement, and perception had to be managed continuously. He never assumed stability was permanent. He approached each day as a test of adaptability and judgment. He had grown increasingly aware that leadership was not about dominance, but about guidance and perception. People followed him not because they feared him, but because they trusted his judgment, respected his consistency, and felt secure under his influence. This subtle form of leadership was more resilient than any forceful display of power could be. Jack's awareness of timing extended beyond immediate interactions. He understood the importance of long-term planning and the cascading effects of choices made today. Strategic patience allowed him to align people, opportunities, and circumstances in ways that seemed natural but were the result of careful orchestration. Influence, in Jack's understanding, was cumulative, a series of measured decisions that built a foundation of respect and reliability over years. Despite the ever-increasing complexity of his life, Jack maintained routines that reinforced clarity and focus. He exercised discipline in daily habits, valuing simplicity in schedule, diet, and movement. These routines kept his mind sharp and preserved the energy necessary to navigate the city's subtle currents effectively. Observation, strategy, patience, and influence had become intertwined in his existence. He moved with the city, never against it, never ahead of it, but always in harmony with its rhythms. He had learned to anticipate shifts, respond subtly, and shape outcomes quietly. In essence, Jack had become both participant and orchestrator, a figure who influenced events without needing to announce his presence. Jack McGurn's reputation, carefully cultivated over years, continued to grow. People spoke of him not as someone who sought attention, but as someone whose presence and judgment mattered. He was both respected and trusted, a rare combination in a city where volatility often undermined relationships and influence. As the years progressed, Jack understood that the path ahead would demand even more from him. More patience, more clarity, more subtle orchestration. Yet he felt prepared, not because he was invincible, but because he had mastered the art of observation, the discipline of restraint, and the power of subtle influence. These tools, more than any overt action, ensured that he would continue to navigate the city with confidence, shaping outcomes quietly and effectively, and securing a legacy built on measured presence and enduring judgment. The city of Chicago continued to shift and hum around him, unaware that Jack McGurn's careful attention was guiding currents in subtle, powerful ways. And Jack, ever watchful, continued to walk its streets, observing, calculating, influencing, and preparing for the challenges that lay ahead, knowing that true mastery lay in patience, perception, and the quiet art of control. Jack McGurn's life had evolved into a careful balance of influence, observation, and strategy. By this point, the young man who once moved with raw energy through Chicago streets had become a master of subtlety, patience, and calculated presence. He had learned that true power was rarely exercised through force or spectacle. It was exercised through perception, restraint, and the quiet orchestration of events. Every interaction, every decision, every gesture was part of a larger rhythm, one that Jack understood intimately. He moved through the city with a sense of rhythm, attuned to its subtle shifts. Neighborhoods, once familiar, now revealed layers of complexity. Alliances forming and dissolving, opportunities emerging in hidden corners, and tensions simmering just beneath the surface. Jack's keen awareness allowed him to sense these shifts before others did, positioning himself strategically without drawing undue attention. Timing, he knew, was more critical than action itself. His relationships had matured into a network of trust, loyalty, and interdependence. Friends, allies, and colleagues sought his guidance not because of fear, but because they valued his judgment and discretion. Jack understood that trust was the most delicate currency in any relationship. One misstep could undo years of careful cultivation. He watched, listened, and waited, allowing people to reveal themselves through behavior rather than words. Consistency over time had become his measure of character, and he rewarded it with measured support. Jack's ability to read people had grown extraordinary. He could discern motives, intentions, and unspoken concerns with remarkable accuracy. Every conversation was layered. Beneath casual words lay hints, hesitations, and subtle cues. Jack absorbed them all, using this insight to guide outcomes subtly, often allowing people to feel that decisions were their own while they aligned with his vision. Influence, he had discovered, was most effective when invisible. The city, ever-changing and unpredictable, remained both a challenge and a teacher. New figures appeared, ambitious and eager to leave their mark, while established ones shifted or faded quietly. Jack adapted, never relying solely on his reputation or past achievements. Influence required constant maintenance, observation, and adjustment. He remained vigilant, understanding that stability was a continuous effort rather than a static state. Jack's personal discipline had deepened, shaping his approach to life and strategy. Daily routines, early mornings, quiet reflection, deliberate exercise, grounded him, providing clarity and focus. He avoided indulgences that dulled the mind, recognizing that clarity was his greatest asset. Even in moments of leisure, Jack observed, reflected, and refined his understanding of people, situations, and the environment. One of his most profound strengths was restraint. He had learned to act only when necessary, to speak only when it carried meaning, and to wait when patience was the wiser choice. Impulsivity, he understood, was the downfall of many who sought influence without understanding its nuances. Jack's calm composure in tense situations often disarmed others, allowing him to navigate challenges that might have overwhelmed less disciplined men. He reflected often on the transformation he had undergone. The boy who once hustled, seeking attention and proving himself, had grown into a man who moved quietly but deliberately, shaping outcomes without ostentation. Identity, Jack realized, was not fixed. It was cultivated through choices, discipline, and awareness. He honored his past but did not let it dictate his present or future. Strategic observation extended beyond people to the environment itself. Jack understood that cities, like people, operated in rhythms and patterns. He noted how commerce, movement, and social interactions shifted subtly over time. These observations allowed him to anticipate changes, preempt conflicts, and seize opportunities that others overlooked. Influence, in this sense, was less about action and more about preparation, timing, and subtle adjustment. Jack also nurtured his inner circle carefully. Allies were chosen for their reliability, loyalty, and understanding of long-term vision rather than short-term gain. Generosity, when extended, was deliberate and meaningful, reinforcing bonds without creating dependency. By aligning values, behavior, and opportunity, Jack ensured that his network remained cohesive and resilient, capable of navigating the city's complexities together. Despite his growing stature and influence, Jack remained reflective and introspective. He questioned his assumptions, reevaluated his strategies, and maintained an acute awareness of the fragility of success. Complacency, he knew, was a dangerous luxury. Every advantage required vigilance, every relationship attention, and every decision foresight. He increasingly viewed challenges as opportunities to test and refine his judgment. Misunderstandings, rival ambitions, and subtle manipulations were all data points, providing insight into character, reliability, and potential outcomes. Jack approached each situation analytically, combining experience, intuition, and observation to arrive at solutions that minimized risk and maximized strategic advantage. The passage of time also brought clarity regarding influence and legacy. Jack recognized that immediate gains were fleeting. Long-term stability required cultivating respect, trust, and credibility over years. He measured his success not in accolades or recognition, but in the endurance of relationships, the subtle shaping of outcomes, and the ability to navigate complexity with calm and effectiveness. Jack's mastery of perception had become a key asset. People responded to him with respect, deference, and trust, often unconsciously. He understood the psychological impact of presence, demeanor, and subtle communication. By maintaining consistency, patience, and awareness, Jack shaped the behavior of others without overt assertion, guiding outcomes quietly and reliably. Even as he operated within this web of influence, Jack maintained a personal code. Discipline, integrity, and foresight guided him, not only in public interactions but also in private decisions. He recognized that true influence required alignment between principle and action, and he worked to ensure that his strategies reflected both prudence and ethical consideration. Jack's relationship with the city itself had matured. He no longer viewed Chicago as a backdrop to his ambitions. It was a dynamic, responsive environment that required constant engagement. He read its subtle cues, the flow of people, the rise and fall of enterprises, the murmurs of communities, and integrated this intelligence into his decision-making. The city was both a partner and a canvas, and Jack had become adept at navigating its complexities. Through years of observation, experience, and careful refinement, Jack McGurn had evolved into a figure whose influence was pervasive yet understated, steady yet adaptable. He moved through the currents of Chicago with grace, foresight, and composure, shaping outcomes while preserving flexibility, anticipating challenges, while seizing opportunities and maintaining control without ever needing to display it overtly. As the city moved around him, Jack McGurn remained a stabilizing, guiding force, an architect of subtle influence whose legacy was built not on spectacle, but on discipline, observation, and the quiet mastery of human dynamics. Each step, each decision, and each moment of restraint further solidified the foundation of his enduring presence, preparing him for the chapters of life still to come and the challenges that would require every ounce of wisdom, patience, and insight he had accumulated over a lifetime navigating a complex, ever-changing world. Jack McGurn, as he entered this phase of his life, had come to embody the balance between observation, patience, and subtle influence. Chicago's streets were no longer just paths to navigate. They were instruments, each corner, each building, each interaction part of a complex network that required careful attention. Jack had learned to read these subtle currents, understanding that influence was as much about timing and perception as it was about action. He moved with a quiet confidence, aware of the weight his presence carried. People noticed him not because he demanded attention, but because he had cultivated an aura of reliability and authority. A glance, a pause, a carefully chosen word. These small gestures had more power than grand displays ever could. Jack had discovered that subtlety often commanded more respect than force, that influence worked best when it was invisible yet unmistakable. The network of relationships he maintained was both extensive and carefully curated. Each person had been chosen for their loyalty, reliability, and alignment with long-term objectives. Jack understood that trust was fragile. It had to be nurtured continuously and safeguarded vigilantly. He observed behaviors, noting inconsistencies, hesitations, and unspoken concerns. Patterns revealed themselves over time, and Jack used this knowledge to guide decisions, manage conflicts, and reinforce alliances. Jack's discipline extended beyond his interactions to his daily routines. He valued consistency, structure, and clarity. Early mornings allowed for reflection, Quiet walks offered perspective, and disciplined practices kept his mind sharp. He avoided indulgence, understanding that focus and clarity were essential to maintaining influence in a city that thrived on unpredictability and rapid change. Observation had become a second nature to him. He noticed not only what was said, but how it was said, what was left unsaid, and the subtle cues that revealed true intent. Conversations were layered with meaning, and Jack listened to every layer. This skill allowed him to anticipate behavior, preempt conflicts, and shape outcomes without overt interference. People often left his presence feeling guided, empowered, and respected, unaware of the careful orchestration behind it. Timing had become his most powerful tool. Jack knew when to act, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Impulsivity was a danger he had long since learned to avoid. He understood that moments of tension, when handled with patience, often resolved themselves in ways that reinforced his position. His calm demeanor under pressure was both a shield and a lever, allowing him to maintain control without confrontation. Jack also maintained a careful balance between visibility and subtlety. Being seen too clearly made one predictable. Being absent entirely invited disregard. He positioned himself where influence could be exercised quietly yet effectively. He understood the psychological impact of presence, and he used it judiciously. People aligned with him, not through fear, but through respect and trust, often without realizing how their behavior was being guided. His awareness extended to the environment itself. Jack read the city like a living organism, noting shifts in commerce, social patterns, and community dynamics. He understood that neighborhoods, like people, had rhythms, and that by observing these rhythms, he could anticipate change and position himself advantageously. This approach allowed him to navigate complexity without forcing outcomes, to guide situations subtly rather than impose them overtly. Jack's reflection on his own identity was continuous. He evaluated his motives, actions, and decisions, ensuring alignment between principle and practice. He understood that legacy was not built on spectacle or notoriety, but on consistency, reliability, and the enduring impact of choices. Each interaction, each decision, was a thread in the tapestry of influence he was weaving, and he approached them with intentionality. The city presented challenges, both overt and subtle. Ambition, rivalry, and unpredictability were constant companions. Jack met these challenges with strategy rather than reaction, with foresight rather than impulse. By maintaining clarity, patience, and discipline, he navigated these pressures effectively, preserving his position and reinforcing the respect of those around him. Relationships were maintained through a combination of observation, subtle guidance, and deliberate action. Jack's generosity was measured, his interventions calculated, and his counsel sought after because it was consistently reliable. Loyalty was cultivated not through fear, but through respect and demonstrated understanding. Those who followed him did so because alignment with his judgment served their long-term interests. Jack also developed a keen understanding of human behavior under pressure. He observed how people reacted to success, disappointment, and perceived power. He used this knowledge to anticipate decisions, manage expectations, and guide outcomes without overt control. Subtle shifts in tone, posture, and word choice often revealed more than any explicit statement, and Jack had mastered the ability to interpret and act upon these signals. He was increasingly aware of the long-term consequences of decisions. Immediate gains were often tempting, but Jack valued endurance over speed. He weighed options carefully, considering both immediate outcomes and ripple effects that would manifest over months or years. This approach allowed him to build influence that was resilient, adaptable, and enduring. Jack's discipline extended to emotional intelligence. He maintained composure in moments that would provoke rash action in others. He managed his own reactions, measured his responses, and considered the broader implications of every interaction. This emotional self-regulation was a source of power, allowing him to guide outcomes calmly and strategically. The city's complexities required Jack to remain vigilant and adaptive. New challenges emerged continuously, from shifts in social dynamics to the ambitions of others. Jack navigated these with a combination of foresight, discretion, and strategic patience. By maintaining clarity, observing patterns, and guiding interactions subtly, he continued to exert influence without the need for overt demonstration. Jack's influence was a product of observation, patience, and strategic action. He moved through the city as both participant and orchestrator, understanding that control was often less about direct intervention and more about shaping the environment, guiding perception, and timing actions precisely. His subtle mastery allowed him to navigate the unpredictable currents of Chicago effectively. At the same time, Jack remained mindful of his own grounding. Family, close friends, and personal routines offered stability amid the constant flux. He valued these connections and maintained them deliberately, understanding that personal foundations reinforced public influence. Balance between public presence and private grounding became a critical element of his approach. Jack McGurn had evolved into a figure whose influence was pervasive yet understated, strategic yet invisible. He guided outcomes with calm authority, shaped perception with subtle gestures, and navigated complexity with foresight and patience. The city around him was alive, dynamic, and often unpredictable, but Jack had learned to move with it, shaping events quietly and effectively, ensuring that his presence remained a stabilizing, guiding force in a world that demanded vigilance, clarity, and careful orchestration at every turn. By this stage, Jack understood that influence was cumulative, built over years of consistent action, observation, and strategic restraint. Each decision, each interaction, each carefully measured gesture contributed to a foundation of enduring authority and respect. He had mastered the art of guiding outcomes without forcing them, ensuring that his legacy would be defined not by spectacle, but by subtle, persistent, and intelligent presence in the city he had learned to navigate so masterfully. By the time Jack McGurn reached the later years of his life, he had become a quiet force within Chicago, a man whose presence shaped events more than any loud declaration could. His influence was built on observation, patience, and the careful cultivation of trust. He moved through the city with calm assurance, reading its currents, guiding outcomes subtly, and maintaining relationships with precision and care. Jack understood that true power was less about dominance and more about wisdom, knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to let events unfold naturally. The streets he had once hustled through were now a map of insight, each corner and interaction contributing to a network of understanding he had spent decades refining. His legacy was not measured by notoriety or fame, but by the quiet, enduring impact he had on those around him. He had mastered the art of subtle influence, shaping the rhythm of the city and the lives of those who trusted him with skill and discretion. In the end, Jack McGurn became more than a man of action. He became a master of presence, patience, and perception, leaving behind a story of wisdom, strategy, and enduring respect. A life defined not by spectacle, but by quiet mastery.